The afternoon crowd at the small city cafe was the usual mix of people trying to escape their busy day. Some were typing on laptops, some were talking quietly with friends, and others simply enjoyed a cup of coffee before returning to work. The smell of fresh coffee beans and warm bread filled the air. Outside, traffic moved slowly through the street, and inside, soft music played in the background. At a small table near the window sat a man whom most people would not notice. He wore a simple dark jacket and looked a little tired, like someone who had been working since early morning. A few papers were spread neatly in front of him, and a half-finished cup of coffee rested beside them. From time to time, he wrote something down with a pen, then paused to think. His name was Daniel. To anyone passing by, Daniel looked like an ordinary man. He was quiet, calm, and kept himself. He was not dressed in expensive clothes, and nothing about him seemed special or important. If someone glanced at him for more than a second, they might notice the deep focus in his eyes or the way he seemed used to carrying responsibility. But most people never looked long enough to notice. Daniel liked it that way. The cafe had become one of the few places where he could sit for a while and work in peace. After dropping his young daughter at school earlier that morning, he had gone straight to several meetings. Now he finally had a quiet moment to organize his thoughts before the next part of his day. He checked his watch briefly, then returned to the paperwork. Outside the window, people hurried past with umbrellas and bags. Each person focused on their own life. Everything seemed normal, until the loud voice near the counter broke the calm atmosphere. "This is not what I ordered," a young woman said sharply. The conversation inside the cafe slowly faded as several people turned their heads toward the counter. The woman standing there looked fashionable and confident. Her clothes were stylish, and her friends stood beside her, holding their drinks while watching the situation with amused expressions. The cafe employee behind the counter looked nervous but polite. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "Let me fix that for you right away." But the woman did not seem interested in a quick solution. "I already waited 10 minutes, she replied loudly. "How hard is it to make a simple drink?" Her voice carried across the room. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The employee tried to stay calm, offering again to remake the order. Daniel glanced up briefly from his papers, mostly because the raised voices made it hard to concentrate. He looked toward the counter for a moment, then returned his attention to his work. Unfortunately, that small glance was enough for the woman to notice. She turned her head and saw Daniel sitting at the window table. For a moment, she stared at him. Then she frowned. "What are you looking at?" she called across the room. Daniel looked up again, confused. He realized she was speaking to him. "Sorry," he said calmly. "I wasn't looking at you." But she had already started walking toward his table, her heels tapping loudly on the floor. Her friends followed a few steps behind, curious and entertained. The cafe grew quiet as people watched the scene unfold. Daniel slowly placed his pen down and looked up at her. He could already sense the situation turning into something unnecessary. "You were staring," she said, crossing her arms. "No," Daniel replied politely. "I was just looking toward the counter." "Don't lie," she said with a small laugh. "Men always think they can get away with that." A few of her friends chuckled softly behind her. Daniel stayed calm. "I'm sorry if it looked that way," he said. "That wasn't my intention." But instead of ending the conversation, the woman seemed even more irritated by his calm response. "So now you're pretending to be polite," she said. "That's even worse." Several people nearby shifted awkwardly in their seats. The cafe manager had also noticed the tension and stepped out from behind the counter, watching carefully. Daniel remained seated. "I'm just trying to finish my work," he said quietly. "Work?" she repeated, looking at the papers on the table like they were something amusing. "You mean those little notes?" Her friends laughed again. Daniel did not react. He simply gathered the papers together neatly. The woman leaned slightly toward the table, examining him as if she had already decided who he was. "Let me guess," she continued. "You sit here all day pretending to be busy, so people think you're important." One of her friends added, "Maybe he's writing a novel." More laughter. Daniel sighed softly, not with anger, but with the quiet patience of someone who had dealt with difficult people before. "Ma'am," he said calmly, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Oh, really? She replied quickly. Then explain it. There's nothing to explain, Daniel said. I simply looked up when the voices got louder. That's all. But she was not listening anymore. Her attention had shifted to the phone, lying on the table next to his coffee. Who are you texting? She asked suddenly. No one, Daniel said. Are you complaining about me? She said with a mocking tone. No, Daniel answered. She picked up the phone before he could stop her. Hey, Daniel said, reaching slightly forward. But she held it away from him with a smirk. Relax, she said. I'm just curious who you would call. Her friends laughed again, as if the whole moment were entertainment. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. He did not want to turn the moment into a bigger scene than it already was. Please give that back, he said calmly. Instead of returning it immediately, she looked around the cafe, noticing the small audience that had formed. Then she tossed the phone back onto the table in front of him. Fine, she said with a dismissive wave. Then she added the sentence that made several people in the room exchange looks. Call whoever you want. Her tone was full of sarcasm. Maybe someone will actually care. She laughed. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Daniel looked down at the phone resting beside his coffee cup. He did not rush. He did not argue. Instead, he slowly picked up the phone and unlocked the screen. The woman crossed her arms again, clearly expecting nothing to happen. This should be good, one of her friends whispered. A few customers pretended to return to their drinks, but their eyes kept drifting back toward the table. Daniel scrolled through his contacts for a second. Then he stopped. Without saying another word, he pressed a name and lifted the phone to his ear. The cafe grew even quieter as the call began to ring. The woman rolled her eyes dramatically. What? Is your big brother coming? She joked. Her friends laughed again. But Daniel did not react to comments. He simply waited as the phone continued ringing. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Then suddenly the call connected. Daniel's expression remained calm as he spoke. Hello, he said quietly. The voice on the other end responded, though no one else in the cafe could hear what was being said. Daniel listened for a moment. Yes, he continued. I'm at the cafe on West Street. The woman leaned slightly closer, trying to hear. There was a small situation, Daniel added in the same calm tone. Another pause. No, nothing serious, he said. But I thought you should know. The people around the table watched carefully now. The woman's confident smile began to fade just a little, though she still tried to appear amused. Yes, Daniel said again into the phone. Then he nodded slightly, even though the other person could not see him. Thank you, he said with quiet respect. I appreciate it. After another short pause, he ended the call. The phone screen went dark as he placed it gently back on the table. The woman waited a second. Then she laughed again, though this time the sound was slightly forced. Wow, she said. That looked very dramatic. Her friends joined in, though their laughter was softer now. So what happens next? She asked. Daniel picked up his coffee and took a calm sip. Then he simply said, We'll see. The woman expected some kind of reaction after a question, but Daniel did not give her one. He simply sat there with the same calm expression and slowly placed his phone beside his cup again. The quiet confidence in his behavior made the moment feel strangely uncomfortable for the people watching. For the first time since the argument started, the woman seemed unsure about what to say next. She cleared her throat and forced a small laugh. So that's it, she said, glancing back at her friends. You made a dramatic call, and now we just wait? Daniel did not raise his voice or show anger. He simply nodded once. Yes, he replied. That simple answer confused her even more. She expected him to argue or defend himself. Instead, he acted as if nothing unusual had happened. You're serious? She said. Very, Daniel replied calmly. Her friends exchanged looks. The situation that had started as entertainment suddenly felt different. It was no longer clear who was actually in control of the moment. The cafe manager slowly approached the table, trying to calm things down before the situation became worse. Is everything all right here? He asked carefully. Daniel looked up at him and gave a polite nod. Everything is fine, he said. The woman spoke quickly before the manager could respond. Actually, no, she said. This man was staring at me earlier, and now he's making weird phone calls like he's trying to scare us. Several people nearby shifted in their seats again, unsure whether they should keep watching or pretend nothing was happening. The manager looked at Daniel. Sir, were you bothering these ladies? Daniel shook his head. No, he answered simply. I was working. The manager looked uncertain. Daniel did not seem like someone who would cause trouble, but the woman standing in front of him clearly believed she was right. Look, the manager said carefully, we just want everyone to enjoy their time here. Maybe we can all calm down and... I'm perfectly calm, the woman interrupted. Her arms were still crossed tightly. But he clearly thinks he can threaten us by calling someone. Daniel sighed quietly, though the sound was barely noticeable. I didn't threaten anyone, he said. Then why did you call someone? She asked quickly. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Because you told me to, he replied. That answer caused a few quiet chuckles from people sitting nearby. The woman immediately turned toward them. Is something funny? She snapped. The laughter stopped instantly. The manager rubbed his forehead slightly, realizing the situation was becoming more complicated than it needed to be. Maybe it would be best if we all just moved on, he suggested gently. But the woman still looked irritated. No, she said firmly. I want to know who he called. Daniel remained relaxed in his chair. Someone wanted to know if I was all right, he answered. That doesn't explain anything, she said. It explains enough, Daniel replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the cafe window, cars continued passing to the street like nothing unusual was happening. Inside, however, the quiet tension remained. The woman glanced at the door briefly, then back at Daniel. So, we're just supposed to believe someone important is coming, she said with another forced laugh. Daniel shrugged slightly. Believe whatever you like, he said. Her friend seemed less confident now. Maybe we should just go, one of them whispered, but the woman shook her head. No, she said quietly. I want to see this. Daniel looked down at his papers again and calmly stacked them together. It was clear he had no interest in continuing the argument that somehow made the woman even more frustrated. You're very confident for someone sitting alone, she said. Daniel looked up again, meeting her eyes. Being calm isn't the same as being confident, he replied. Then what is it? She asked. Just patience, he said. The answer made her frown slightly. The manager finally stepped away, deciding the situation was no longer his place of control unless something serious happened. For the next few minutes, the cafe returned to a strange, half-normal state. Some customers returned to their conversations, though many of them still watched Daniel's table from time to time. The woman and her friends moved to a nearby table, but did not leave. They clearly wanted to see what would happen next. Daniel quietly finished reviewing his documents. He placed them into a thin folder and slid it into his bag. Then he checked his watch again. Almost 10 minutes had passed since the call. The woman noticed a movement and smirked again. Looks like your rescue team got lost, she said. Daniel did not answer. He simply took another slow sip of his coffee. Another minute passed. Then, too, outside, something unusual began to happen. A dark vehicle slowly pulled up near the sidewalk in front of the cafe. At first, no one inside paid much attention. Cars stopped on that street all the time. But then a second vehicle arrived, and then another. One of the customers, sitting near the window, leaned forward slightly. That's strange, he murmured. The woman and her friends turned to look outside. 3 black cars were now parked neatly along the curb. The engines turned off almost at the same moment. For a second, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. Several men stepped out, each dressed in dark suits. Their movements were calm and organized, not rushed or aggressive. They looked around briefly, scanning the area before walking toward the cafe entrance. Inside the cafe, the quiet tension suddenly returned. What is that about? One customer whispered. The manager behind the counter looked toward the window and immediately stood straighter. He seemed to recognize the kind of arrival this was. The woman frowned slightly as she watched the group approach the door. Probably some business meeting, she muttered, trying to sound unconcerned. But one of her friends spoke quietly. Why would they all come here? The cafe door opened. The small bell above it rang softly. The suited men stepped inside one by one, calmly looking around the room. Their eyes briefly moved across the tables, observing everyone inside. The room became completely silent. Even the background music suddenly felt louder because no one else was speaking. One of the men walked toward the counter and spoke quietly with the manager. The manager nodded quickly and pointed toward the window tables. More eyes slowly turned toward Daniel. He had not moved from his seat. He simply watched the moment unfold with the same quiet patience he had shown from the beginning. The woman felt a small knot form in her stomach, though she did not want to admit it. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to her friends. But her voice sounded less confident now. A few seconds later, the cafe door opened again. This time, an older man entered. He walked slowly but with clear purpose. His gray hair and serious expression gave him the appearance of someone used to making important decisions. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere in the cafe changed completely. The manager immediately left the counter and walked toward him with visible respect. "Good afternoon, sir," the manager said politely. The older man nodded once. Then he looked around the room. His eyes stopped when they reached Daniel, and without hesitation, he began walking directly toward his table. The woman felt her heart beat a little faster as she watched him approach. Her friends remained completely silent now. Every person in the cafe seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. Daniel calmly stood up from his chair as the older man reached the table. The two men looked at each other for a brief moment. Then the older man's serious expression softened slightly. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. The entire cafe listened carefully. Daniel gave a small, respectful nod. "Thank you for coming," he replied. The woman slowly realized something that made her stomach drop. The man standing in front of Daniel was not just anyone, and the calm man she had been mocking for the past 20 minutes suddenly looked very different from the person she thought he was. The older man reached Daniel's table and stopped. He looked at him for a long moment, his eyes calm but full of respect. Daniel did not show any sign of nervousness. He simply nodded slightly, a small gesture that spoke volumes about their history. The quiet confidence in Daniel's posture made the older man smile faintly. The woman at the nearby table could hardly breathe. She had come into the cafe expecting a small entertainment, maybe a dramatic moment. But what she saw now was something she had not imagined. The calm man she had ridiculed was clearly someone of importance, and the older man approaching him seemed to know him very well. For a moment, the cafe was completely silent. The background music felt distant, and the soft hum of the air conditioner was all that could be heard. Even the manager, who had been trying to keep the situation under control, seemed frozen, unsure how to act in front of these two men. Daniel's gaze stayed on the older man. He did not introduce anyone else, nor did he speak more than necessary. The older man extended his hand first. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice calm but carrying authority. Daniel shook it gently. "Good afternoon," he replied. The older man's attention then shifted toward the woman and her friends. His eyes briefly studied them, though he said nothing. The silence seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The woman's confident posture started to crumble as she realized that this was no ordinary encounter. One of her friends whispered, "Who is he?" "Some kind of boss." The woman shook her head slightly, unable to respond. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The man Daniel had called on the phone clearly had influence, and Daniel himself seemed completely at ease, almost like he had been expecting this all along. "Please, sit down," the older man said to Daniel. Daniel nodded and pulled out the chair opposite him. The older man followed and took the seat with a quiet dignity that made everyone watching aware that this was someone with experience, someone used to command. "Daniel," the older man said, "I received your message. I understand what happened." Daniel listened attentively and then replied softly, "Yes, sir. I wanted to make sure it was handled without causing unnecessary trouble." The older man's expression softened further. "You always handle things calmly. That's why I trust you." The woman could no longer hide her curiosity. She leaned slightly forward, trying to catch bits of the conversation. "Wait," she whispered to her friend. "He knows him? Who is he?" Her friend shook their head slowly, realizing they had no idea. but both were captivated by the scene. The older man turned his gaze to the woman and her friends for a brief moment. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had expected someone to step in, maybe a manager or an employee. But instead, the man in front of Daniel seemed to command the room, simply by his presence. "I'm sorry, sir," she finally managed to say. There was a misunderstanding. The older man's eyes softened, but his tone remained authoritative. "I see. It is important to treat everyone with respect, no matter the situation." "Agreed?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." The woman swallowed hard. She could feel every eye in the cafe watching, noticing her lack of confidence now. The earlier laughter and mockery felt far away, replaced by a sudden awareness of her own actions. "Daniel," the older man continued, "I trust you've taken care of things quietly. That is always the right choice." Daniel replied, "I tried to ensure that everyone remained safe and calm. I didn't want anyone embarrassed or hurt." The older man nodded approvingly. "That is why I've always relied on you. Your discretion is as important as your courage." The woman's jaw tightened. She had come to the cafe thinking she could entertain herself at Daniel's expense, but she now understood she had been completely wrong about him. This was a man who had earned the respect of someone clearly powerful, someone who commanded authority, without needing to raise his voice. Her friends shifted nervously in their seats, suddenly aware of how tense the atmosphere had become. The casual smirks from a few minutes ago had disappeared. The quiet dignity of the two men at the table had changed the tone of the entire room. Daniel carefully gathered his belongings, placing his folder into his bag. His calm movements contrasted sharply with the sudden discomfort of the woman and her friends. The older man noticed her expression. "You were laughing before," he said gently. "It is easy to judge someone without knowing their story." The woman's face reddened slightly. She tried to force a laugh, but it came out weak. I didn't mean any harm," she stammered. Daniel looked at her quietly. He did not raise his voice or scold her. He simply nodded once. "That's good," he said softly, "but it's always better to think before laughing at someone else." The older man leaned back in his chair slightly, giving a small smile. "Respect is earned not by appearances, but by actions. Remember that." The woman swallowed again, realizing the weight of the words. She had mocked Daniel for what she thought were ordinary reasons, but now it was clear she had underestimated him completely. The manager finally cleared his throat, gently suggesting that the group move to another table or leave if they wished. The woman and her friends nodded, deciding to quietly relocate, their earlier confidence now replaced by self-consciousness. Outside, a few more people noticed the black vehicles still parked along the curb. Some stared at the cafe entrance, curious about the activity inside. It was unusual for anyone to arrive with such an entourage in the middle of a regular afternoon. The older man looked at Daniel one last time before standing. "I will make sure everything is handled properly," he said. "You have done your part well." Daniel nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." The older man turned toward the door and left, followed closely by the suited men. Their departure was as calm and organized as their arrival, leaving a quiet impression on everyone inside. Daniel gathered his things and slowly stood up, placing his bag over his shoulder. He took one last look at the cafe before heading to the door, calm and composed as always. The woman, now seated at another table, could not stop watching him leave. Her friends tried to speak, but she held up a finger, her mind still processing everything she had seen. The people who had been observing quietly returned to their drinks and conversations, but the tension in the room lingered. Daniel's calmness in the presence of the older man had left a lasting impression on everyone. For the woman, it was a moment she would not forget. She realized how wrong she had been in judging someone based on appearances, and how easily she had assumed she knew more than she did. As Daniel stepped outside, the afternoon sun caught the edges of the building, casting long shadows along the street. The quiet hum of the city continued around him, yet the encounter inside the cafe remained vivid in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The woman finally spoke softly to her friends. I have never seen anyone handle a situation like that." Her friend nodded slowly. "Neither have I. He's different." They both remained silent, each reflecting on what had just happened. The lesson was clear. Appearances can be deceiving, and respect is something that is earned, not assumed. Daniel walked away from the cafe, the earlier laughter and mockery completely behind him. He had handled the situation without raising his voice, without causing unnecessary trouble, and had relied on the quiet support of someone he trusted. For those who had witnessed it, the afternoon had turned from an ordinary cafe visit into a lesson in humility, patience, and respect. The quiet man at the corner table had shown that strength is not always loud or aggressive. It can be calm, collected, and quietly commanding. The woman watched him disappear down the street, her thoughts racing. She had learned more in those few minutes than she had expected, and it was a lesson she would carry with her for a long time. Judging someone without knowing their story could lead to embarrassment, regret, and a realization that she had been completely wrong. Daniel continued walking, the sunlight warming his face, unaware of the impression he had left behind. For him, it was simply another day handled with patience, respect, and quiet strength. After the older man and his team left the cafe, the atmosphere inside slowly returned to normal, but a quiet tension lingered. Customers sipped their drinks and murmured to each other, some still glancing toward the window where Daniel had been seated. The woman and her friends had quietly moved to a corner, speaking in hushed voices, still trying to process what had just happened. Outside, Daniel walked down the street, his steps calm and measured. The sunlight fell softly on the buildings, and the sounds of the city continued around him. Despite everything that had occurred, he felt no rush. There was no sense of triumph or need for recognition. He had handled the situation with patience and care, just as he always did. He reached a quiet side street and paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The events at the cafe replayed in his mind, not as a source of stress, but as a reminder of how easily misunderstandings could spiral out of control. He thought of the woman, confident and loud, unaware of who he was and what his connections meant. It had been a simple moment, yet it had escalated quickly because of assumptions and pride. Meanwhile, the woman sat in the corner of the cafe, still staring toward the entrance. She couldn't shake the image of Daniel standing calmly while the powerful older man had approached him with respect. Her mind ran through every interaction, realizing how foolish she had been to mock him. The laughter she had shared with her friends now felt distant and embarrassing. She clenched her hands in her lap, wishing she could erase the scene from memory. Her friends exchanged glances, both equally affected. "I've never seen someone handle like that," one whispered. It was like he knew exactly what to do. The woman nodded slowly, her face flushed. "We underestimated him," she admitted. Completely? Back on the street, Daniel continued walking, approaching a small park nearby. He often came here when he needed a moment of quiet reflection. The park was empty this time of day, save for a few people walking their dogs or jogging along the paths. He found a bench under a large tree and sat down, letting the soft breeze brush against his face. He thought about his daughter, who would be waiting for him at home. She was young, full of curiosity and energy, and he wanted to set an example for her, show her that strength wasn't always loud or aggressive. Sometimes, real strength was in staying calm, making smart choices, and respecting others even when they failed to respect you. As he sat, Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from the older man. "Well done today. You handled everything perfectly. Trust your instincts always." Daniel smiled faintly and typed back a simple reply. "Thank you. I appreciate your guidance." He put the phone away and leaned back against the bench, letting the sunlight warm his face. The city moved on around him, unaware of the quiet drama that had unfolded just a short walk away. Meanwhile, the woman had decided to leave the cafe. She walked slowly toward the door, glancing back one last time. Daniel was gone, vanished into the flow of the city. She felt a mix of frustration, awe, and reflection. The encounter had shaken her assumptions and left her questioning how she treated others. Outside, she watched people walking past, each absorbed in their own lives. She realized that everyone had a story she didn't know, a reason behind their calm or their actions. She had judged Daniel in seconds, based solely on appearances, and had been completely wrong. The lesson weighed heavily on her, and she felt a quiet determination to be more thoughtful in the future. Daniel walked through the park and toward the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the buildings and sidewalks. He paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Nearby, children played on the pavement, their laughter carrying on the breeze. He smiled faintly at their energy, remembering the joy his own daughter brought to his life every day. At home, he entered the apartment quietly, greeting his daughter with a warm smile. She ran to him with a small backpack in hand, talking excitedly about her day at school. Daniel listened attentively, asking questions and laughing softly at her stories. The events at the cafe and the presence of the powerful older man were far from his mind now. Here, in the simplicity of home, he found the moments that truly mattered. Later that evening, the woman and her friends gathered somewhere else, still discussing the cafe incident. The woman spoke more cautiously this time, reflecting on how quickly she had assumed she understood someone else's life. Her friends nodded, realizing that appearances could be misleading and that confidence alone did not always indicate true power or control. For Daniel, the day ended quietly. He helped his daughter with homework, prepared a simple dinner, and shared a few laughs. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on, illuminating the streets in a warm glow. He felt a deep sense of calm, knowing he had managed a difficult situation with patience and integrity. The cafe incident had faded from his mind, replaced by the ordinary rhythms of home life. Yet for those who had witnessed it, the lesson lingered. They had seen a quiet man remain composed under scrutiny, navigate a challenging situation with care, and earn the respect of someone powerful without raising his voice. It was a reminder that strength, humility, and wisdom often spoke louder than words or appearances. As night fell, Daniel settled into a chair by the window, looking out at the quiet streets. The city moved on, unaware of the subtle drama that had occurred hours earlier. He thought about the importance of discretion, patience, and understanding. For him, these were not just principles. They were ways to live, ways to teach his daughter, and ways to interact with the world thoughtfully. In another part of the city, the woman finally went home, reflecting on the day's events. She understood that judgments made quickly could lead to embarrassment and regret. She promised herself she would be more mindful in the future, considering the full story before forming opinions about others. The encounter with Daniel had left a lasting impression, one that would shape the way she viewed people for a long time. For Daniel, the quiet moments at home, the lessons imparted to his daughter, and the calm he maintained throughout the day were more valuable than any recognition or acknowledgement. He had handled a situation that could have escalated, protecting himself, others, and the dignity of everyone involved. And in the process, he had quietly reminded those who had observed that true strength is measured not by appearances, but by actions, patience, and respect. The next morning, the city streets were alive with movement, as usual. People hurried to work. Children walked to school, and familiar sounds of the city filled the air. Daniel had already left for his early errands, carrying a small bag with essentials and a thermos of coffee. He enjoyed the quiet moments in the morning, when the streets were just beginning to fill and the world felt calm before the rush of the day. As he walked, he reflected on the events of the previous day. The cafe incident had been unusual, but it had reminded him of the importance of composure and patience. His mind wandered briefly to the woman who had mocked him, and he felt a small, quiet satisfaction knowing that she had seen his side of things, not through confrontation, but through the calm, collected actions he had taken. Actions, he knew, often spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, the woman was still thinking about what had happened. She had returned home, replaying the scene in her mind. The quiet man who had seemed so ordinary was in fact someone others respected deeply. It made her reconsider her own behavior, the judgments she had made in a matter of seconds. She realized how quickly assumptions could lead to embarrassment and how little she had known about the people around her. Her friends had tried to console her, saying it was just a small misunderstanding. But she knew it was more than that. She had learned a lesson that could not be undone, that appearances were deceptive and respect had to be earned, not assumed. The memory of Daniel's calm demeanor and the older man's authoritative presence stayed with her. Back in the city, Daniel had stopped at a small market to pick up some fresh bread and fruit. He greeted the shopkeepers politely, exchanging small talk and smiles. These simple interactions reminded him of the world beyond the dramatic moments. He had no desire for recognition, only a life lived thoughtfully with integrity and care. At home, his daughter was waiting for him after school. She ran into his arms with excitement, eager to share the stories from her day. Daniel listened attentively, asking questions, laughing softly, and encouraging her to think critically about the things she had learned. For him, these moments were far more meaningful than any display of power or influence. Teaching respect, kindness, and patience was his priority, and he did it quietly without show. Later in the day, Daniel received a brief call from the older man. The voice on the other end was calm and measured. "Daniel, well done yesterday. Your patience and careful approach were exactly what was needed." The older man said. "Thank you," Daniel replied simply. "I did what felt right." "That's always enough," the older man said. "Remember, actions often speak louder than words. Today, tomorrow, and always." Daniel smiled faintly and ended the call. He knew the older man was correct. The best way to influence the world was not through aggression or boasting, but through steady, thoughtful action. That was a lesson he carried not only for himself but for his daughter, who would learn the same in time.